Is Pinocchio the worst Disney remake? Since the early 2010s, Disney has been pushing out live-action remakes of their beloved animated films in the hopes of capitalizing off of both their older and younger generation of fans. Some of these early projects, like 2010's Alice in Wonderland or 2014's Maleficent, were creative in some ways, exploring new themes, focusing on different characters, and taking the story in a unique direction. But as the years passed and Disney realized that they could make $1 billion off of name recognition alone, these live-action remakes have become less and less innovative, with many in recent years being shot-for-shot recreations of their animated counterparts, raising the question as to why they were being made at all. Money is the obvious answer. Disney's most recent remake is Pinocchio, a live-action adaptation of the 1940 film of the same name, which itself is based on the 1883 Italian book, The Adventures of Pinocchio. And it might be the worst Disney remake so far, which is quite the achievement considering some of the lackluster films that came before it. In today's video, I'll be taking a look at the Pinocchio film and discuss everything I disliked about it. Obviously, there will be spoilers, but can you even spoil something that's been around for over 100 years? Anyway, let's get into it. For those who might not be familiar with Disney's take on the tale of Pinocchio, let's have a brief refresher. Pinocchio is a wooden puppet who is created by the lonely old woodcarver, Geppetto. The puppet is then brought to life by the Blue Fairy, who has answered Geppetto's heartfelt wish for a son, and she tells Pinocchio that if he's brave, truthful, and selfless, he can become a real boy. Although Pinocchio vows to accomplish this feat, he's regularly sidetracked from his quest, either because of his own decisions or because others exploit his naivete. He's sent to school but is convinced by a con artist fox and cat duo to become an actor in a puppet show instead, ignoring the advice of his conscience, Jiminy Cricket. The puppet master, Stromboli, is revealed to be an evil man who intends to exploit Pinocchio for monetary gain, but Pinocchio is able to escape. Pinocchio and a group of other children are then brought to Pleasure Island, a place where misbehavior is encouraged and the kids are transformed into donkeys. Pinocchio manages to escape once again and journeys home along with Jiminy, but they discover that Geppetto has already left to try and find him. Pinocchio heads out to rescue his father, and while crossing the ocean, he is swallowed by the giant sea monster, Monstro, who has also swallowed Geppetto. After reuniting, they're able to come up with a plan to escape from Monstro's stomach, but in doing so, they're injured. In the original animated film, Pinocchio is believed to have perished in the aftermath, but is revived by the Blue Fairy, who rewards him for his hard work and good behavior. In the live-action film, Geppetto is believed to have died and Pinocchio mourns him, but then Geppetto awakens and congratulates Pinocchio for his selflessness and bravery, and the two return home. Mixed messages and mischaracterizations. Part of what made the original film so interesting is that Pinocchio, despite being made of wood, acts human from the very beginning, making mistakes just as any child might and having to live with the consequences of his actions. Although he's naive and impressionable, he's also mischievous and impulsive, which prompts him to make choices without thinking them through. While you could interpret the film as a cautionary tale about misbehaving, I see it more as a reminder that no matter how many mistakes you've made in the past, it's never too late to do the right thing. Unfortunately, the 2022 film fails to deliver such an inspiring message. In the live-action film, Pinocchio is depicted as nothing more than a simpleton who does whatever someone tells him to do, never making any decisions on his own, thereby absolving him of any personal responsibility and reducing him to a victim of circumstance. Besides this direction making him utterly devoid of personality and autonomy, it also results in very little character development. So unlike his previous counterpart, he doesn't seem to learn anything. Plus, he's rather annoying. In the original film, Pinocchio is first led astray by Honest John because the cunning fox is able to appeal to Pinocchio's innate materialism, shallowness, and vanity, and he goes along with them of his own volition. Meanwhile, in the 2022 film, Pinocchio declines their offer, actually listening to the advice that Jiminy, his conscience, tells him. When he does eventually join John, it's an understandable decision on Pinocchio's part. He's been kicked out of school and is treated like a pariah. Jiminy is nowhere to be found, and he's told that becoming famous will make him a real boy. I don't blame him one bit. Even the way Pinocchio learns about the consequences of lying has less emotional weight in the new film. In the original, the Blue Fairy comes to rescue him from Stromboli, and Pinocchio comes up with a tall tale about being kidnapped by monsters to explain how he got himself into the situation, which is exactly the kind of lie that a child would realistically come up with. And the Blue Fairy refuses to help him until he apologizes, thereby teaching him a valuable lesson about dishonesty. In the new film, Pinocchio instead lies to Jiminy, telling him that he didn't want to be famous and that he wanted to go to school, which doesn't really seem like a lie considering he literally couldn't go to school. As such, his punishment and eventual apology feels unnecessary, because he didn't really do anything wrong. This sequence in the film also sends the mixed message that being dishonest is only wrong sometimes, with Pinocchio literally lying in order to help them escape.
You want to know something? I don't want to be a real boy!
In the original film, Pinocchio is convinced by Honest John to go to Pleasure Island for a much-deserved vacation, and upon arriving he immediately begins misbehaving just like the other kids, justifying his eventual transformation into a donkey as he's literally making an ass of himself. In the live-action film, he's taken to Pleasure Island by accident and finds himself disturbed by the other children's actions, refusing to participate in anything besides harmless fun, which makes his punishment unwarranted.
I don't want to be a jerk. I want to be a real boy.
The way the two films resolve the situation is also vastly different, with the original Pinocchio accepting his fate and spending the remainder of the film with ears and a tail until the Blue Fairy transforms him into a human. The new Pinocchio is able to quickly get rid of his donkey parts by deciding to find his father, which comes across as flimsy reasoning considering he'd already been trying to do that for half of the movie. As you can see, all of these changes make Pinocchio's mistakes the fault of others, not his own, which makes him an unrelatable protagonist who can do no wrong. While Pinocchio has a similar journey in both films, in the original he's motivated to become a real boy not just because he believes it's what Geppetto wants, but because he finds himself drawn to humanity in the first place, making him a character that you find yourself rooting for. The new version of Pinocchio only seems determined to become a real boy because that's what he was told to do when he first came to life. To make matters worse, the film doesn't even make it clear that Pinocchio did become a real boy, with Jiminy Cricket telling the audience,
"In his heart, Pinocchio is as real as any real boy could ever be."
This is quite the odd conclusion, considering this version of Pinocchio was good the entire time. He deserved a reward. I think there's a very high likelihood that Disney didn't want to receive any backlash for depicting their main character as naughty, but by doing so they completely missed the point of the story. It's crucial that Pinocchio makes these mistakes because in doing so he is truly repentant for his actions, which allows him to change for the better. By refusing to have the character be bad, every punishment he receives feels unwarranted and his eventual success undeserved. Another character that the film grossly misrepresents is Jiminy Cricket. In the animated film, he starts off as somewhat jaded, insecure, and high-strung, but he's rewarded by the Blue Fairy for his growth and maturity just like Pinocchio is. By definition, one's conscience is representative of one's own moral code, and as such no one's conscience is perfect or without flaws, but if you watch the 2022 Pinocchio film, you wouldn't know that. In this version, Jiminy Cricket is someone who can do no wrong, constantly telling Pinocchio the right thing to do, only to be thwarted by someone else's meddling. He's perpetually snarky, acts holier-than-thou, and frequently belittles Pinocchio for his mistakes. And as a result, I find him to be far less likable than his hand-drawn counterpart. Let's not forget that the original Jiminy Cricket was so well liked and respected that he was the host of a series of educational films, teaching decades of children about the human body, animals, and stranger danger. The 2022 version of Jiminy comes across as nothing more than a condescending and arrogant asshole. The character regularly breaks the fourth wall, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't serve much of a purpose in the story and happens far too often for my tastes. For the most part, all he does is reiterate what's happening, which ruins the pacing and emotional weight of the scene, and his too frequent jokes are just awful. If he was my conscience, I would actively ignore what he said. As for Geppetto, he has significantly more screen time in this film than the original, but most of his scenes just involve Tom Hanks bumbling around with a bad mustache and accent, so I don't really care for all of the time spent on the character. His animated counterpart is far more adorable. Overall, it just feels like Tom Hanks phoned it in, which I don't really blame him for, but it does make it more difficult to resonate with Geppetto and Pinocchio's relationship. The only character that I found myself liking as much as their original iteration is the Blue Fairy. The original Blue Fairy was depicted as a sort of otherworldly, omniscient being who took on the role of a mother. The new version is a little more fun and playful, although I do think she's a little bit too harsh when she tells Pinocchio that he isn't actually a real boy. I also find it quite odd that she only appears in the film a single time, whereas in the original she regularly comes to Pinocchio's aid, first to rescue him from Stromboli, then to help him find Geppetto, and lastly to revive him and turn him into a real boy. It made her character more involved in the story, and also gave Pinocchio another adult role model besides Jiminy. In the new film, these moments are instead given to other characters, including new additions to the story like Fabiana and the talking seagull, Sophia. Side note, I actually despise the bird. Every time she showed up, I wanted to fast forward. Derivative to a fault. Like the lackluster remakes of Beauty and the Beast, Lady and the Tramp, and Aladdin, Pinocchio follows its source material to a T, incorporating the exact same events and sequences that occur in the 1940 film without bothering to update them in a meaningful way. The story of Pinocchio definitely has the potential to be relevant for modern audiences. After all, at its core, it's simply about the ups and downs of growing up, so it feels like a missed opportunity for Disney to not even attempt an interesting retelling. The only changes the film makes is adding new characters, most of whom are forgettable at best. Fabiana, the injured ballerina turned puppeteer, is an interesting character, but she feels utterly wasted in the story, only popping up when necessary and having a character arc that feels undeveloped. One small change that I found myself absolutely disappointed by was how Pinocchio goes about finding Geppetto. Instead of walking along the bottom of the ocean, which was one of the coolest sequences in the original film, he instead zooms along the water like a wooden jet ski. It's not only utterly absurd, but it's such a stagnant and boring shot that it completely falls flat in the action department.
Faster, Pinocchio! Faster! Spin those clodhoppers!
A problem that I have with many Disney films nowadays, whether or not they're remakes, is that they rely too heavily on contemporary humor, language, and pop culture, disregarding whether or not it actually makes sense for the film's setting, tone, or message. Pinocchio is no exception, including lines about influencers and HE double hockey sticks that are more cringy than they are comedic. By incorporating this modern language, the film inevitably dates itself, turning a timeless film into a time-sensitive one.
An entrepreneur! Nay, an influencer! We need a simple, strong stage name. I've got it. Chris Pine!
Like many of Disney's live-action remakes, the film has a few new songs, none of which are particularly memorable. Geppetto's are probably the worst of the bunch, but that honestly isn't saying much. Nightmare Fuel. Director Robert Zemeckis is well known for his use of visual effects and performance capture, having previously directed The Polar Express, Beowulf, A Christmas Carol, and The Witches. But despite all of this prior experience, Pinocchio still winds up falling short in the visuals department. Jiminy Cricket, Honest John, Cleo the Cat, Monster the Sea Monster, and basically every other CGI character are given a hyper-realistic appearance, and in many cases, it's absolutely terrifying. The scene where Lampwick turns into a donkey is the stuff of nightmares, although it doesn't make as lasting an impression as the 1940 version, which is absolutely heartbreaking. There are certain things that can be accomplished with traditional hand-drawn animation that aren't as easily done with computer animation, and when a project is rushed like this one, these faults become all the more obvious. Emotion is especially difficult to depict in a hyper-realistic style. Just look at the Lion King remake. And that's one of the biggest problems with the Pinocchio film. If we can't get a good grasp of what the characters are feeling, how are we supposed to care about them? Another issue I had with the animation is with Pinocchio himself, who has a vastly different art style from everyone else. You might recall that people had the opposite issue with the 2020 Sonic movie, with people protesting the decision to give the hedgehog a more realistic appearance that included teeth and eerily human eyes. But in films like that, as well as 2018's Detective Pikachu, this cartoonish direction makes sense as those characters aren't supposed to be rooted in reality. Not to mention that the art style is consistent amongst all of the characters of this type, which makes it more cohesive. Pinocchio's cartoonishness doesn't play well with the other characters, and is especially jarring to look at in wide shots, where it never looks like he's actually in the scene. Plus, I think his eyes are absolutely soulless, making him look more like a character from a horror movie than a children's film. Let's sell some toys. As already mentioned, Pinocchio's appearance in this film is a clear attempt to familiarize young audiences with the character. thereby inspiring purchases of merchandise with him on it, which I'm sure has been on the decline in recent years considering the movie is over 80 years old. From the moment the film begins, it shoves the Disney brand down our throats, with Jiminy Cricket floating down while singing When You Wish Upon a Star, a song that was written for the original film that has since become ubiquitous with Disney itself. The film is blatantly obvious in its attempt to push product, with Geppetto's shop being made up of various trinkets that reference other Disney movies like Toy Story or Maleficent. Before someone says, "Oh come on, those are cute Easter eggs," they show them in multiple scenes and for several seconds. They're selling something. Pleasure Island is even reminiscent of the Disney theme parks, having an assortment of rides and snacks that the film's young audience will no doubt drool over, thereby missing the point entirely. All of this undisguised advertising is incredibly off-putting, and the obvious money grab could be seen as a metaphor for the Disney brand in general. Overall, the film lacks the magic and charm of the original movie, which is a shame because the story itself is full of potential. I'd say you shouldn't waste your time on it. Watch the 1940 version instead, or 1996's Adventures of Pinocchio starring Jonathan Taylor Thomas. What are your thoughts on the new Pinocchio movie? I hope you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!